Hi everyone. And St. Petersburg did add to that too. And today we're going to see both the bright side, so to speak, of St. Petersburg, the opulent side of it, and also something that Dostoevsky would see on a daily basis, as well as the character of his works. It's the guts of St. Petersburg, the inner side of it. It's not all about the glossy, beautiful facades of expensive buildings. It's not just palaces. It's those winding alleyways, those cheap um, rooms that one would rent on the upper floor, and also this black ladders, like the black staircases, well, not ladders, the staircases, right? The one that the servants would use. So all that and even more. That's what is expected today. Once again, I'm just showing you that this area is indeed, we still call it St. Petersburg of Dostoevsky, and there is a monument in that area. It's kind of this one of the central squares in that neighborhood. And last time we finished on the Stremyanne Street. In this area, the streets would have this names of like Blacksmith Street, the Stremyanne Street, that is the Harness Street. So this was the so-called Slobody. It's like the neighborhoods where people of certain trades would be settling together. So if you needed to get a harness, you would go to Stremyanne. If you needed to, I don't know, get a horseshoe for your horse or anything, you would go to the Blacksmith Avenue or Blacksmith Lane or Kuznechny Lane. And we are in the harness lane. And in the very end of the tour, I just to not to finish on a very depressive note. That is, I showed you one of the very depressed looking buildings where a writer of the 19th century committed a suicide. So yeah, because St. Petersburg could be that gloomy too, but that writer also had a schizophrenia, so it's not just the city. But I thought to also show you the magical side of it. That is the house built by the fascinating architect Bubur, who was famous for his absolutely whimsical Art Nouveau, Northern Art Nouveau masterpieces scattered around the city. There are not so many, actually, not scattered, but like, they're like gems here and there. And this is the amazing example of Northern Art Nouveau, Alexei Bubir. He um, he designed his well, it's Northern Art Nouveau because of the dark color of the stones, local stones, and it looks very similar to the Art Nouveau you can find in Sweden or in Finland because of the stones. So it's practically the same area and the same region. So Art Nouveau, you use materials that grow, that are present in your area, and they are local to your country and culture. So here we have this very also gloomy colors of the facade, but also all these whimsical creatures, right? The fishes, the owls, the birds, the flowers that you can find in in St. Petersburg region, and also all these pine tree cones, pikes, fishes, so the owls, all these local birds that you can find, and lots of other whimsical stuff. This house is one of the Art Nouveau masterpieces for sure. It was built in around 1905, 1906, and also those masks. They're like masks of some mysterious forest creatures. And the house is like this inside out. And we are even going to visit the lobby. You know how I know, and you know how much I love lobbies of St. Petersburg, and it's a thing in itself. It looks like out of this world. And the house itself, it's one of the amazing examples of Art Nouveau, and it's one of the best examples also of Buber's houses. And it's interesting that there is another whimsical thing, a phenomenon of St. Petersburg, but from a very different period. There's just very small garden. It's called an elves garden because in this building built by Bubur during the Soviet period, like late Soviet period, starting from the 70s, there used to be a cafe called Elf. And that happened to be the place where all the Leningrad hippies would hang out, and also musicians. And that's why it's kind of Elves Garden. And it's still called Elves Garden. And well, it's just here there's like this. It's in Russian, obviously, but I will explain. So this is kind of the street sign. Like it shows you how many meters there are to other significant places where Leningrad hippies would hang out. Like there was a Saigon bar, there was a gastritis canteen, and also some a rock club, and yeah, kind of other places where the community would be hanging out. And I found some photographs also of that time. Just look at all these people, like look how they are dressed. And yeah, those were free spirits. They risked every day, no, they could have been easily caught by the police, and many would be fined. Well, they wouldn't be taken to gulag or anything. Those are very different times, obviously. But still, these people were very much opposed to everything that at that time the Soviet power, well, the Communist Party, would still cling to. And a lot of famous rock musicians from Leningrad Rock School grew from that elves garden. They would hang out in that garden. Look how nicely dressed they are. So I mean, it looks funny nowadays, but back then it was something very extraordinary compared to what other people in general would be wearing. And you see the graffiti on the wall like Ringo. That must be Ringo Starr, right? And well, Beatles were forbidden as well. So though they, I would say they were like on the fringe, honestly. Yeah, so that's another kind of a place out of this world. These people definitely dreamt of being taken outside of the Soviet Union. What can I say? But we are in the lobby, and we spoke about it that well, that lobbies were there. Well, there two kinds for the land for the well the highly welcomed tenants. And also there were like cases for the servants, right? And they would not really have any decoration, whereas the other lobby would have. And the more the merrier, because that pretty much um, would set the tone and would set the price, right? For the landlords and for their tenants. So the more impressive the lobby looks, the more expensive the rent would be. And right now you see there are radiators, but back in the days, lobbies were still very cold and they didn't have radiators, so there would be a fireplace. The fireplace is still there, however, they are not, well, it's not functioning anymore. It's just there for the sake of beauty, just that. And the house from the very beginning had an elevator, and this is a big deal. Well, okay, this is like early 1900s, and then that by that time there would have been already quite a lot of buildings with the, well, okay, not a lot, but let's say 10% maybe of all the tenant houses would have elevators. That's not much, but it's not so bad. But that automatically meant that the house was expensive. It had telephones, elevator, um, and just the beautiful decorations. So all that, and you see that the outside of the facade, and the inside and the back side of the building, they look the same. They have one and the same concept. This is a big deal for sure. And the house has been repaired. It's so-called like a overhaul, a total repair, and it still has this amazing stained glass, which was restored. You may remember from the previous tours of St. Petersburg, there used to be this project to restore stained glass, It's a volunteer project. People donate, and the volunteer specialists, well, like restorers, stained glass specialists, they do the restoration, well, free of charge. The money is only needed to buy materials and some other stuff. So, thanks to that project, this stained glass was restored, and the original design was also by Buberi, obviously. And Buberi also built an apartment for himself in this house, and that was a very common thing. So architects, just like all the other merchants and people, well, who had at least some money, they would take a loan and build a house, buy land and build a house, and this is how all this investment would pay off within like several years. In some cases it would be just 2 or 3 years, and this is how the rent would start to pay off. It depended on, obviously, the down payment, depending on the budget, depending on the rent, the tenants, right, and how much the rent would be. But in average, it was like 5 to 7 years when all the investment would gradually start to pay off. Well, but unfortunately, Bubir didn't live long in the house. He went to Ukraine and passed away there. Some claim that he was even murdered there. Well, that's a bit of a mysterious story, has really nothing to do with the revolution. It's just some private matters, but the house is still there, and Bubur is remembered and forever will be remembered. And next to the beautiful Art Nouveau masterpiece, there is a very different house, which is also a masterpiece, but of eclectic style. It's This house is a little older, and it belonged to someone, well, to a merchant, Moser, from Germans. We don't know much about Muser himself. Well, we know that he owned a lot, well, several manufacturers across the country, and just like many other businessmen, he would invest in the real estate in the capital, just like that. So Muser built this house in this eclectic style, so it's a little older than Art Nouveau. And this house has also a very lovely lobby, but a very different one. And in general, these two buildings standing one next to another with such different decorations, and with only about a decade apart, it shows you how diverse the city was, how vibrant, how different the city was. Also restored and repaired lobby, gorgeous. I mean, it could easily fit just one more apartment. But for the landlords, it was important to impress. It was important to, well, to show the status of the building, and demonstrate also, because your lobby also tells a lot about who you are, right? The lobby of your house. So that's why the architect, Schaub was his name, by the way. He was also like from Germans. He, uh, I think he did a good job, and just seeing this lobby, I mean, you kind of have an idea that it's not just an average person who lives in this house. And still, there are about 13 apartments only in this building. So building a house for 13 apartments, like, there must have been really, really high rent in this building. I mean, it definitely, it is definitely so. And this house also has a beautiful window in the ceiling. Why so? Well, since this house was a little older, it was built while there was still no electricity, because the previous one had electricity, right? So because it, well, it had elevator, but this one didn't. And it only had gas lamps, right? And oil, well, yeah, well, yeah, kind of gas lamps. um that means it didn't have enough light, so it was essential for lobbies like that. It's the same in Tbilisi. We saw a lot of these glass ceilings, but in a much worse condition, obviously. So this added a lot more daylight to the lobby, which was important. And you see, there is even no space for an elevator, whereas in Buber's house, the elevator was meant to be there from the very beginning. It was in the blueprints, which is not the case with most of the buildings. And we will talk about it, how they would got around to this issue of having no elevators, of not having space for elevators, because eventually they managed to, but not everywhere. We'll talk about it. So it's elevators is one of the topics for today, because as you know, for me, for these tours, I also talking about like everyday life, what the households will be like, what people would be using on a daily basis, how people would go about things, and yeah. So um this is the ceiling itself, the just three floors, and the upper floor, you have this window. That window takes you to the apartment actually. So what is this over here? Again, because of the lack of electricity, or absence of electricity, daylight was absolutely essential. And also, using as much light as possible was essential for kitchens, mainly for kitchens and bathrooms. They would be using the light from from the glass ceiling, so hence those windows. So in fact, those windows, well, they are over, well, they would take exactly to the kitchens of, this is not bathrooms, those are kitchens over there. I'm not sure if it's one and the same apartment or two. That's a good question. But as I said, only 13 or 12 of 13 apartments in this house. And this has always been a very expensive place to live in. That's for sure. I can't tell you whether the original ceiling had a stained glass. I don't know that. But even if it didn't have a stained glass, even if it just was regular glass, I think it looks impressive anyway. Yeah, so that's the house. That's the way it looks from the outside. There's no way you could tell what it looks from the inside, right? So, but that's a lovely lobby, absolutely charming and unique. Absolutely unique. So you see three floors, and this is it, and not so many apartments. And which I really like, this house. It kind of mimics, kind of copies, right? The house from the other side, right? I mean the Buber's house. However, it's a new house. It's a new building. It was constructed in I think 2010s. I'm not sure which year, and it's a very expensive real estate in St. Petersburg. Very expensive. Everything when it was built, like it was absolutely top notch. I've never been inside, and for a long time I actually had no idea that's a new building because it looks good. It looks doesn't look too new, and it kind of this house kind of creates a beautiful framing for the Muser house. I mean, the one that's for the pink one. Anyway, let's move on. But yeah, so this is the new building. It looks impressive to me. It looks really lovely. But yeah, it's a very different thing. And for example, you see the building next to it, right across the street. It's modern one, and it looks pretty ugly, unfortunately. So that's a good example of modern architecture that blends in with the surrounding, with with the area. And now I want to walk in the courtyards. I want to explore a little bit of the what's behind the facade. And we're going to spend quite some time in this very big courtyard next to the Vladimirsky Avenue. So Vladimirsky Avenue, that's the same avenue where the statue of Fyodor Dostoyevsky is standing. That's where the tour started. And we are going to be in this area of Vladimirsky Avenue anyway. And from the big courtyard, so you see Vladimirsky Avenue, the like takes you to this area, like there's a playground. I'm sure you can see the kids on the seesaw, right? So that's the big playground, and from that playground we can actually go several ways, and all of that is the area of Dostoevsky. times, and Dostoevsky must have walked those courtyards gazillion of times, honestly. And eventually, we're going to find ourselves on the Rubenstein Street, which you may remember from my bar hopping tours or bar crawls, virtual bar crawls. So that's the bar street of St. Petersburg. But we're not going to spend much time there this time, but we're going to spend much time like in those courtyards. And also we are going to see a couple more locations along the way. Very typical archway, very typical entrance. So the facade can be beautiful and lovely, but once you enter the archway, anything can expect you. But in most cases in this area, since most buildings had been built before Art Nouveau, that's mid 19th century, and they would be, not all of them would be masterpieces. They would be pretty similar in many ways, kind of typical buildings. Well, I would say in most cases it would be shabby walls, yellow facades, and a lot of windows and well-shaped yards, and that's it. And look at this. So this is, by the way, the biggest courtyards in St. Petersburg, in the old area, I mean, and it's gigantic, it's enormous. We know that how small the courtyards can be. In the next episode we are going to see one of the smallest courtyards in St. Petersburg. But so this is a big one, mid 19th century. The area would have a lot of storage buildings as well, but they were knocked down in the 20th century. And multiple buildings, well, you saw a lot of archways, so would eventually lead to this courtyard. And this courtyard was kind of a hub from where many other courtyards would you could take. That's how it worked in the city. Also, in these archways, you see the doors, right? Well, I mean, you could see at least two doors. Normally, in these archways would be the apartments for dvorniks, for the street sweepers, for the people who not only did they keep the place clean, but they also um, made sure everyone didn't misbehave. That there would be peace and quiet and law and order in the streets, and they were in close contact with the police. And if you wanted to have a good reputation, if you didn't want to have any problems in the community you're living, you needed to be very polite and respectful towards your dvornik. Dvorniks was a highly prestigious profession. Yeah, and also really well, not like really, really well paid, but it was decently paid. And also here you can see this interesting metal column, or sorry, not metal, stone something. That was the protection. So once the carriages enter the archway, in order for the carriages not to bang on the walls and well, damage the walls, these protections would be placed there. This stone post would be placed there. But you see that it's much smaller than originally was, because buildings, they tend to move a little bit, and also the historical layer would grow, and then they would put the road and put the asphalt. So originally it was much taller, and it will be placed from two sides, so you could see it. And you see that there are some other ways, some other archways that take you to other areas, other courtyards. But in general, you see, it's a very typical thing. Multiple windows overlooking each other. But in this case, there is a distance, and there is a chance that people would not see what you're wearing, and if you're not wearing anything, if they look out of the window. And also, by the way, this area was affected by floods. We are really not far from the water. The Fontanka River is, well, quite around the corner, I would say. And also there is a bypass canal, so the city was really, really badly damaged by floods. And St. Petersburg, over its 30 years of history, a little less than that even, experienced more than 300 floods. That's a big deal. And the most, just the biggest damage was made on in 1824 and 1924, right? So that's 1924. The and by the way, the the most catastrophic flood took place in 1691. At that time, the territory where St. Petersburg is standing now was under control of the Swedish, and in the Swedish chronicles, they mentioned that the water rose by 25 feet. That's like 7 or 8 meters or something like that. I'm not entirely sure how much it is, but that's really a lot. So yes, and this is uh, an illustration in the newspaper about, well, 1924, 23rd of September. That's a very severe flooding in Leningrad. So we're talking already about the Soviet time. So let's move on. So from this archway, we find ourselves in another courtyard of a similar kind, and again, don't expect to see anything glamorous and beautiful there at all, because there is nothing. And but you see the Brandmauer, right? So the Brandmauer, that's the wall that would protect you during the fire. It had to be there. It had to be there for just to ensure fire safety, because the buildings were placed one next to another, and you can see that, right? There was, in many cases, there was just no space between the buildings, which meant that the risk of conflagration was extremely high, and this type of walls were a savior indeed. So the Brandmauer is there. And well, another playground, which is good, but obviously back then there wouldn't be playgrounds for kids. Normally kids would go to the parks. There were not so many parks, but there were parks, and the kids playground is the thing of the Soviet period, but not from the imperial times for sure. That's it was not common to place kids playgrounds and courtyards, and the smaller courtyards the better it was, because the more space a landowner had to build apartments, and more apartments means more money from the tenants. You see this interesting thing attached to the building, right? It's like a cage. Well, actually, this is the elevator, the external elevator. So all these buildings were built like in the 1860s, 1870s, so no elevators at all. And there was no even place for the elevators. But in many cases, it was possible to build elevators just outside, to attach it from the outside. And that's why you can see those shafts of elevators, quite ugly looking, really just, but I mean, there's no other choice. You really need to have an elevator. And that's what it looks like. It looks ugly, but it's backyard, so it's kind of doable. It definitely worth it anyway. Back in the days before elevators were implemented, before elevators were even invented, well, obviously the higher the floor was, the cheaper the rent would be, and that's why the upper floors would normally be rented by students, workers. Sometimes one and the same apartment could be sublet several times. There could be several tenants in one and the same apartment. Sometimes the workers would be even sharing the rooms. It just depended on the budget and on the location. And another courtyard. So one courtyard takes you to another courtyard, and then takes you to another courtyard. That's how you find yourself in a completely, like in the new street, like several blocks away. And that saved you time. Look, another corridor, and here you see a portrait of the very popular actress, one of the one of the symbols, in fact, of St. Petersburg, Elisa Friendlich. She's still around, by the way, and she's the star of so many absolutely iconic Soviet movies. And well, Misha and I, we must have shown at least a couple of them when we spoke about Soviet movies, when we spoke about the Soviet New Year celebrations and what kind of movies we watch. So yeah, Alisa Friendlich is also a theater actress, and she's definitely one of the symbols of St. Petersburg. That's for sure. So, and if you watch the previous tour, then you must remember that in another archway, there was a portrait of Fyodor Dostoyevsky, and we'll see another portrait. So this like these are the iconic, the symbols of the city. Some of them are still around, some of them are not. Well, Alisa Friendlich is still here, which is amazing. And you really need to know the area because one can be easily lost in there. It's not easy. Well, this is another portrait in the same archway of Sergei Dovlatov. His name would probably not mean anything to you, but if you ask, I'm sure some of you know, some Russian immigrants from the back Soviet times, and if you ask them, they for sure know who Sergei Dovlatov was. He was a Soviet dissident who eventually, well, he first was a journalist. For a long time, he also lived in Tallinn, but then eventually he had to move, and he moved to the States, and he passed away in New York. But so Sergei Dovlatov was a big writer, a big journalist, and a big dissident. He's one of the sort of classics of the 20th century Russian literature. And well, I'm sure you remember there was a thing called samizdat, right? It's when uh, prohibited writers would be published in well, unofficially, well, people would be just typing it and then binding it into books and just distributing it among each other, which was absolutely illegal. And these people risked losing their job, and even sometimes they could be put into prison, so that was a big deal. But it was also Tamizdat when these books would be published from the outside of the country. So somehow manuscripts or a couple of self-typed copies would somehow escape the country, somehow will be smuggled out of the country. That was also an interesting question, how. And then they would be published, and then they will be brought into the country and also distributed outside of the country, among the dissidents. That's interesting. And Davlatov was one of the best sellers well, of this time. But also from Vladimirsky Avenue, from one of those courtyards that we've been to, we can go to an interesting lane. It's called Grafsky Lane. So as I said, that courtyard was like kind of a center, a hub, or from where you could travel to different destinations. And yeah, I'm kind of speeding things up also. Well, that's, by the way, that's a big gap between the buildings. That's a big one. Also, the wall looks a little bit uneven. I don't know why. But yeah, that's well, a human can pass through this, I mean, between these two buildings. That's that's good. And you see, well, if I go back just tiny little bit, let me show you something. Hold on a moment. Well, I will stop. I just want to draw your attention to something. Yeah, you see, just windows overlooking your neighbor's windows and everything. Quite typical thing. Now you go to another courtyard. So this is the connecting. They're like mazes. But then also, you see, all of a sudden, hop, and there is this one section that juts out a little bit. It could be added a little bit later. It could be added at some point while during the construction, or at the stage while you're just planning the building. There was literally no limitations to how small a courtyard could be. It just had to be there, but it could be really, really, really small. And well, the landowners would go out of their way to save money, so to build more apartments. This is an interesting thing, by the way. This wooden thing is the external refrigerator from the post-war times. And it's still there. I don't know if it's still in use, but technically speaking, it could be easily used during winter, because this is like minus temperatures easily. But it's surprising to see it, because most buildings don't have it anymore. But after the war, most would have it. So we are back to the same courtyard, and then if we turn right, we could also exit eventually to the Grafsky Lane, or like Count's Lane, because well, that area used to, well, these land back in the 18th century used to be a big estate that belonged to an aristocratic family of Golovin family. And one of the theories is that the lane was named after the Count Golovin. And as we go from both sides, you see this white shafts of elevators. So these are in good condition. So these are kind of relatively new, or maybe just recently restored elevators. I'm not sure. Maybe they just painted it over and that's it. To the right hand side, you see uh kind of uh the garage for carriages, by the way. Ugly looking building, yes, but you don't see the facade, so it's all hidden from the eyes, and nobody other than like you sees that. That's interesting. Over here, look at all these rooms. I mean, look at all these windows. It's like you see this kind of semicircular windows. They're very low, because actually those are also the rooms where the dvorniks lived. And dvorniks lived for free, by the way. They didn't have to pay because they worked, right, for this community, for this particular area. So they didn't have to pay for their housing, but it would be modest housing for sure. So they would be living in these archways. But now there is an apartment there, a fully fledged apartment. I don't know how big or how small it is, but it does look really small, right? So I don't know. Actually, I would like to visit it one day if possible. Um, yeah, that's by the way the door that takes you to the servants' staircase, or like black staircase as we call it. But I also would like to stop here because you see the apartments. So on the second floor you have apartment 25, and then you have apartment 40. How come? Easy peasy, because of the communal apartments. After the revolution, nationalization came up, and all those apartments, all those buildings would be expropriated from the merchants, from the landlords, and they would be divided into smaller apartments. And let's say if a house originally had 30 apartments, once they would start splitting them, they would be building apartment 31, 32, 33, and they would be on different floors. They don't care. So that's how on one of the same floor you have apartment 7, and then 27, and then 10, and then 28. That's super simple. Yep, but we're not going there. We are going to another lane. Well, we're going to the Grafsky lane, but it still requires a couple more courtyards from us. And now we are in the Grafsky lane, or Count's Lane. It's a small lane, narrow lane that we have walked maybe a couple of times on those tours during Hago times, when I took you on those to those alleyways. It was dark. It was well, a couple of times we did lose connectivity because those are thick walls and a lot of buildings, and sometimes the connection indeed would drop. Well, the avenue itself is not particularly, I would say, magnificent, doesn't really have palaces, but it's also about the people who live in this alley. And in this lane, Fyodor Dostoevsky lived too. In this house, he wrote his very first novel that made him internationally famous, Poor Folk. Misha spoke about the work itself, so I'm not going to stop here. I would focus on the city, but well, Dostoevsky wrote about poor people, wrote about, he didn't write about aristocrats, he would write about just, well, people who he saw on a daily basis living in this area. And he also had a friend who was a doctor, but he just started his career as a doctor, and he would normally treat just poor people, because people who had money would rather go to a more experienced doctor. And Dostoevsky was there quite frequently in the waiting room in the office where his friend, his doctor friend, had a practice, had a medical practice, and he would talk to these people. And this is how he got inspired to write a book about the poor folk. And it happened during the times while Dostoevsky lived in this very house, in this particular house, that's not looking anything um, special. And last time we spoke about the fact that Dostoevsky really liked to live in corner apartments. They were cheaper because they were normally very cold, because the well because of their location, right? And that was exactly his window. By the way, also, the avenue ends facing this theater, the Lansabet Theater. It's a popular theater with a lot of good actors still there playing, and some of those actors were also stars of some of the Soviet movies, but very few of them are still around, but nevertheless. So the Grafsky Avenue goes all the way there. It's rather short, and it's again, m- in most cases, we're just common people living there. Well, not peasants. I don't mean peasants, but students, clerks, and stuff like that, and people like that. So this very corner apartment is where Dostoevsky wrote his Poor Folk, and he would write it sitting on a windowsill. And from then on, Dostoevsky would always be living in the corner apartments, cheaper, colder, but has more space. And for him, it was absolutely essential to have, well, either a balcony or a big window. So in that very apartment, he had a very big window. And when we did the first tour together, we saw the apartment where he died, and that's actually where the museum is. And I took you to museum about a year ago, and that recording is available for my sponsors. um, there is a link on the chat about the sponsorship thing in case you're interested. And I promise that I would be taking you to all sorts of lobbies, and I think we are done with the opulent ones for today and for tonight. And let's see the less beautiful lobby. Well, I don't think this lobby was, yeah, definitely during the Soviet times it was painted in this ridiculous green color. I would say even the green palette of ridiculous green colors. But so this is the apartment where Dostoevsky lived for a short period of time, but it was, well, long enough for him to finish The Poor Folk. After that, Dostoevsky, well, during the early years of his career, he was very, very politicized, and he took part in sessions of different like secret societies, and in one of them he was caught, and he was put into prison, and he was even sentenced to capital punishment. He was pardoned. the very last minute, and his um, and instead of execution, he was sentenced to 10 years in exile. So after that, he would return, and he would return a completely different person, and he would not be writing about the same things anymore. So indeed, he changed, but it would be much later. So at this point, he's still the fighter for the freedom, for respect, towards common people, poor people. And yeah, he's full of ideals and hopes. And also for him, it was this from that window where he would write the poor folk, he could see the Vladimirsky church. And that's where we started the tour last time, right next to where right now there is a monument to Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Across the street would be this Vladimirsky church, and Dostoevsky was a frequent visitor to this church, to many of the services in there. Now, from the Grafsky Lane, the Grafsky Lane would take us to the famous Rubenstein Street, which is, well, AKA the bar crawl street, the bar hopping street. And we are now entering the Rubenstein Street itself. I don't know if you remember it, but the Fontanka River actually is, no, that's too early, over there, just a 2 minutes walk and you find yourself by the river. So no wonder that area got flooded quite frequently. But not anymore. So because there is a dam and there's not going to be a flood anymore because of that. But this is the Rubenstein Street. Over there is Nevsky Avenue. So we are very central, and the street is very narrow and very. I mean, it's narrow and it's also very short, but it had the biggest number of eateries, bars of different budgets in it. By the way, you see the restaurant called God's, well, bar. We were there once for one of the bar crawls, and you may remember it because of this angel hanging above the bar. Yeah. You see, there is the bar counter, and that's the angel. Yeah, I remember that very well. And I remember I had Oscar the bear with me, and I just tried to make sure he wouldn't see that because, yeah. But anyway, yeah, it was fun. So that's the same bar. I don't know if the bar is still there. I really miss Rubenstein Street. It was also the noisiest street, and in fact, people who lived in that area, they hated all those bars because it was always loud. And even, well, despite the instructions, obviously, and there is a law, like a noise regulation law after 10 p.m., but it never worked because people got drunk every Saturday night, every Friday night, and then it was absolutely unbearable for those who lived in this area. There were a lot of raids from police and everything, and I know that in the recent years there have been a lot of changes, and many bars closed down also because of the economic crisis and everything. But anyway, you kind of have the idea. There are, apart from restaurants, apart from bars, there are also a couple of theaters in this street, so it's not all just about drinking and eating. And also the street itself is quite eclectic. Most of the buildings were built in mid-19th century, couple of them like Art Nouveau period, but there is one that kind of stands out, and this is this house which is called like a teardrop of socialism. This was one of the first experimental buildings of the constructivism of like Soviet Bauhaus period, 19 like 1928, 1932. That's approximately the time. No, that's like the end of the 1920s. I don't remember the exact year, but you have the idea. And this was the community building, a commune building. It only had one toilet per floor, no bathroom, no kitchens, because it was a community building. So every person was a member of a collective, right? Of a community. And that's why washing had to be done in public bathhouses, and there were bathhouses just around the corner. And also, well, for food, why would you need to cook food? And women was not a servant, women was not a maid. Women also had to work along with men in the factories. So everyone would go to the canteen, for big canteen, for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, and they would be consuming the food together, and women wouldn't have to be cooking. The same, there would be laundries, there would be there would be the kindergartens and the very, very small bedrooms, because you didn't need to live in your bedrooms. You didn't need privacy. You would only need those bedrooms to sleep in, and that's it. Right. And that's it. So that's why people who moved in there, it was just horrible. That's why they called it a teardrop of socialism. Eventually there would be renovation made. By the way, you see the interesting shape of the roof. So the roof was there aimed to be a solarium, well, where people would just have sun baths. It's just called solarium. And eventually, sometime, I'm not sure at what time exactly, but during the Soviet period, eventually there was a big overhaul done to this building. And it was good. It was good to go, but yes, from the beginning it was horrible. And um, I will just say a couple words about one of the people who lived in this building. It was Olga Berkholz. You may remember her from the my tours on the siege of Leningrad. She was the voice of the besieged city. She worked at the radio, and she would recite her poems, and also poems by other Russian poets, and that saved people in the besieged city. She herself had a very difficult life. She lost her children, she lost her husband, due to the war and the hunger and the cold. So she survived, and uh, she is forever remembered in the city. And that's the house where she lived, and she also called the house the teardrop of socialism, for sure. And speaking of the Second World War, by the way, next week the world is remembering the victims of the Holocaust. It's International Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is 27th of January. And next weekend, I'm hoping I will be doing a Holocaust Remembrance tour. In Jerusalem, there is a monument to, well, a memorial to Holocaust survivor, well, to victims of Holocaust. It's not Yad Vashem. It was built way before Yad Vashem, and I filmed it for us. There's no way we can go there for a live stream tour for a number of reasons. It's also due to the operation hours, the opening hours of that place. So, but I filmed it for you. It's a museum, it's a memorial, and I'm hoping to take you there on a pre-recorded tour. I the recording, the link is available from my website. Also, it's also on both calendars, and I will be sharing it tomorrow too. So, but as of now, let me share with you the links for tomorrow. That is, so the three tours, just like tonight. I haven't rescheduled the Jerusalem tours because I thought I would be, but then I decided not to because it's so confusing for many of you, which is totally fine. I know I try to be consistent as much as I can, but because I am here, well, the 2 hours behind Belize, it means I have more time for tours. And so what I will be doing one tour before Jerusalem, that is the English Avenue tour, last but one, then Muslim Quarter of Jerusalem. Same time for you, it's just different time for me because I'm traveling. And then I'm taking you to the final episode of the Oldenburg Palace in Tbilisi, right? So this is it. Let me know if you have any questions. Enjoy your festival, dear. Enjoy, Sharon. Yes, Robert, 27th of January is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Israel has its own Yom HaShoah, well, its own also Holocaust Remembrance Day, but that's an international one. But either way, it's an important date. So I thought it would be, since I'm already here, I would be doing this tour, even though it's not. I was hoping to do it a live tour, but I just realized it would not be possible, which is okay, I think, because we'll still see everything. Lots of windows, green, pukey green color, pukey yellow color. Yes, this is true. This is true. And it did feel like prison in many, many ways. So that's why, like, I mean, it seems like logical that some people felt really bad and the conditions people lived in. That's, yeah, absolutely. So we can understand why people really felt this way. Thank you, Mitzi. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Did Misha and no, I don't think Misha ever went to the Gods Bar, and it's one of the bars I would never really go to myself. But since we explored because it was like expensive, like posh, but since we explored and we needed the variety because there were different kinds of places on the Rubenstein Street we dropped by, but that had this. I mean, the cocktails were nice. The interior was interesting, so I'm sure you remember that, Angel, if you watched me back then. So I do remember that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Yes, Dorley, indeed. So we need to get away from the news and whatever happens. Thank you for joining. Thank you also for supporting me. You can do it either by sending a PayPal donation or buying me a coffee. And I can't wait to catch up with you tomorrow as well, for the three tours that I have already mentioned, and hopefully that next weekend too, and and all that. Thank you for everything. The buildings, were they afraid of running out of windows? Um, I don't think that they were afraid of anything, but every room needed a window, and there, well, that was it. You must have sent me Dorley, but I don't remember obviously now. But I won't be adding that to the tour because there is quite a lot to show. That's the Holocaust Remembers Chambers in Mount Zion that I will be talking about, and there is a lot anyway. But I need to see when the one that you sent me. It must be on WhatsApp. That's, well, I need to have a look at it. But obviously, yes, there are many other there are many other monuments across the country as well to the victims, and in general to Holocaust, and in nearly every city, a town in Jerusalem. I mean, in Israel, there is something related to that for sure. Yep. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. I will see you tomorrow, hopefully, and yeah, thanks for everything, and thanks for your support. Bye bye.